You're here because you're trying to make sense of what happened at this weekend's anti-lockdown protests. You're trying to understand why, who's right, who's wrong. And the 30-second news media soundbite you saw didn't cut it. I'm going to try and give you my experience from hours on the ground, interviews, and a week's reflection. I'm going to take you through 3 parts in 3 sections. Shall we call them chapters? First, the protests. Second, the police response. Third, the media coverage. Let's get into chapter 1, the protests. Why were people at this protest? What I saw were 3 groups that each came with different ideas. First, is a strict Victoria-level lockdown curfew of healthy people absolutely necessary? Second, should government restrictions go this far? And how far should they go? And third, does COVID even exist? What are vaccines? Is the New World Order and Soros coming for me? And so many other topics which I'm not even going to get into. What we hear about these, the first 2 parts, is a strict Victoria level lockdown necessary? And second, should the government restrictions go this far? That's what I saw most of the group there have in common why they went there on the day that I saw. And on arrival, what I saw was kind of a party. It was a pretty jovial atmosphere. Only about 10-15% were wearing masks and a fair few children. Mostly probably 3/4 European, maybe even 5/6. About a quarter were over 50, a quarter with age 30 to 50, and about half were below 30-35. 300 I'd say, perhaps more at the perimeter, and fairly well distanced too. Now, I'd love to tell you more about the protest itself, but is it really a police response if the police start before the protest does? So that's the end of that. Chapter 2, the police response. Now, to begin, I saw some dialogue with police happening. Great! I love dialogue. I love a good chat. So if you see me anytime, please stop me for a chat. Tell me a story. I love a good story. But within 5 minutes, this started becoming a beatdown. To understand more about this beatdown that occurred, which probably was some 30 or 40 arrests, I asked someone who experienced arrest himself to come and speak with me. Nick. Nick.
G'day, Chris.
Come on in.
How are you?
Thanks for coming, mate.
Thanks for having me.
Please, have a seat.
Will do.
Tell me, how was your weekend, mate?
Never expected I'd see the kind of things that we saw. I mean, we've seen it happen in other states, but I really didn't expect it to happen here in New South Wales. Yeah, so when I turned up, the first thing I noticed was a very, very large police presence. But I thought, well, maybe, they were just worried about some people getting a little bit out of hand, as protesters can sometimes do. But when I looked at the crowd, I did notice that it was overwhelmingly, it resembled a hippie convention. It was, there was just a really good vibe, a really friendly vibe. It was, I'd describe it as a family atmosphere. I heard one of the senior police officers tell the other officers to go after the ones with the placards first.
Yeah.
And I found that a bit strange, and I just thought, maybe I didn't hear right. I think the heavy-handed police response, it started almost immediately. There was only a matter of minutes before what you could call proceedings starting to police rushing in to remove people simply, I don't even like to call it a protest, having a peaceful rally. But then very quickly the police just moved in quite large numbers and started pulling people away. I think we were all a little bit shocked that they'd come in so hard and heavy so quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then obviously, that became heated, and then the police started forming lines and periodically picking people off and removing them from the area, people getting arrested, things like that. And then, as you say, they started forming a line and sort of herding us around, trying to, I guess, disperse us from the area. Yeah. So gradually they started herding us towards the station for whatever reason. I don't know why. I thought maybe they were going to try and force us to get out of the area on trains, and, if we had to get back to our car, that was our problem. So as that happened, I sort of managed to get past the police line after a while, and find some refuge out of the way, standing just on a short 1 metre high brick wall. And I thought I'd just film what was going on from there. There was a couple of guys next to me that had been arrested, and given the behaviour of the police up till that point, I felt that it was my responsibility to record what was happening in case they needed it. So I was standing up on the wall and doing that. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was well out of the way, and two officers must have picked me out, and they came up and they.
I can jump down. But why? Am I doing something wrong?
Asked me to get down off the wall, which I politely agreed to. I sat down to chat with them, and they gave me a move on direction. Okay. Yeah, so given that I view peaceful protest or peaceful rallying as a fundamental for democracy, I did question their authority to do that, at which time they started to repeat to me whatever the spiel was they had on the paper regarding the health directive. This lasted, it couldn't have even lasted a minute, and they just suddenly arrested me quite forcefully, put me in a wrist lock, started to drag me away from the area very aggressively again. I repeated to them that I'm not being aggressive, I'm not resisting, I was very complicit. I just had some questions that I needed answered, and I just wanted their details. I've noticed on the video footage that I've got, because I was recording all of this, he tried to slap the phone out of my hand as I was being hustled away. Fortunately, he didn't succeed, but I mean, I'm sure that's not standard for police to be doing things like that. Anyway, they took me up a short set of stairs a distance away, and they threw me to the ground. Given that at no time was I violent or aggressive, I mean, I think that was a massive overstretch to be doing that, yeah.
What I left with myself was another few questions. Does Sydney have to choose between Portland-style anarchy and Victorian suffering? For those that don't know what's been happening in Portland, we're now on about 100 days of consecutive nightly protests, which eventually turn into riot, burning, looting, and murdering in Portland. The local law enforcement response is more of a children's carousel. Protesters scream for hours, outrageous property damage occurs, setting things on fire, and after about this, police end up arresting people only for law enforcement and attorney generals and prosecutors to release them, often without any charges. Here in June, we saw marches in every Australian capital city that honestly staggered me. In the middle of this pandemic that we were all told to stay at home and don't go anywhere, 20,000 people here in Sydney filled the streets. For hours they streamed past me. The government said it was illegal, but the police stood by. And only 6 arrests occurred hours after the march. Either these protests were illegal and needed to be stopped, or they're not. I mean, it's pretty straightforward to me, but some people say there's a more nuanced view, which is what we saw in Melbourne. A fairly quiet group of protests in a public park were crushed. There's no other way to put it when you see men in riot gear, when no riot that I saw occurring, certainly not when you compare Portland and Melbourne. These two things, one of these things is not like the other. But it brings me to my next part that I want to share with you. As I try and remind people, there's a justice beyond any of our flawed human laws. Those most willing to sacrifice their individual liberty and comfort for their group cause will triumph over those who are not. Now, it's important to keep in mind that throughout this, we're paying attention to the most extreme elements, and that goes for police as much as it goes for protesters. And that also goes for the commanding officer I saw on the day. Most officers I saw were calm and fairly well put together, friendly even. But the commanding officer was amped up. At one particularly confrontational moment, I saw this police officer march over to his men and say, You! Grab that squealer, give him the warning, and then anyone you see giving a chant, grab him and shove him down onto the ground. You arrest him! No mercy! Yeah, look, even at that moment, I didn't really know what to say, and I still don't now. At one point, I saw a family who were having a conversation with one of the officers, and I'm sure they were saying they were just there for a picnic, but they probably weren't. They were there for a protest. They had their picnic basket and their towel set out. Mum, dad, 2 kids, plus another woman there. And they were trying to argue with the officers, I'm sure. Oh, we don't know anything of what's going on over there. They probably knew. But what happened next surprised me. The officer, shortly after giving the warning and telling them what to do, came up and started picking them up by the shoulders and hauling them up onto their feet and saying that they needed to move on, to which they didn't much like. And I saw the husband end up getting arrested for his, shall we say, resistance. I didn't see any picnics at the BLM march. I saw a lot of signs saying ACAB, F12, no justice, no peace. That's not what I saw at this protest. I can support the police, I can support the superintendent, I can support the officers and the general force and law enforcement and the law in order, while also calling the tactics of the commanding officer that he deployed here heavy-handed. I think he went overboard. I think the officers were doing their best, but this is the price of command. Sometimes they get it wrong. Let's try another example of nuance, where you can support something but criticize an action of what they do, when you can wish someone well, but also wish they don't do whatever they did again. Ned Kelly, he was an example. He was an Australian folk hero, a Robin Hood, a stealing from the rich who didn't earn a cent of it, a triumph for this common Australian man. And he was a villainous murderer, a brutal outlaw who needed to be brought to justice by any means necessary. Was he a hero or a villain? I think Ned Kelly was both. And I think that's a good example we need to remember going into this. We're going to see protesters in this field who are villains and heroes. We are going to see police officers, command and frontline, who are villains and heroes. It's the tactics that they put in play that need to be criticized. And we come back to an old religious question. Can a good man do bad things? And can a bad man do good things? That's the question that many ask of me. Am I a good or bad man? And am I doing good or bad things? Is redemption possible? And I think that's what we need to keep in mind on the left and the right as we look at people who are campaigning for a complete eradication of capitalism and a vehement justice brought upon past injustices, that these two are people. They have kindness in their hearts and they can want the best for you. They can change their minds in a moment, just as you can. And to remember, compassion, not empathy. And that's the same with most of the responses I saw. The majority of the protesters who came to blows with police were tall, well-built young men who were aggressively refusing directions to move on, refusing to identify themselves, and then resisting being detained, and then ending up getting beaten down. Again, it's the exceptions. Like Nick and the family I saw, those outrageous events that we saw stir our hearts the most. But they're isolated incidents, and scuffs will heal. Now, enough of all of that. Let's come to the third part, the coverage, because that's how the people who didn't attend come to understand what happened with what did occur. When I got home, I accepted a montage of arrests from Olympic Park, from 7, 9, 10, Fairfax, and all other manner of news agencies. I didn't see that. Instead, what I saw were bloody faces at Hyde Park at a protest that I wasn't aware was happening until after the day occurred. Instead, I saw rather glowing praise of people who criticized these protests occurring at all. I didn't, from any of the coverage I saw, get a good picture of what happened there. And I ended up finding that perhaps the best way to find out what happened there was what I saw with my own two eyes. because what the news media was describing it was closer to the chaos we were seeing occur regularly in America that they never described as chaos, but peaceful. If you're old enough or have studied enough, then you'll remember an old country called the Soviet Union. It doesn't exist anymore. And you may have even heard of an old newspaper called Pravda. It was Russian for truth. And for most of us in the West, it was a joke. The Washington Post wrote about Pravda in 1987. They called it a fascinating mirror in which Soviet life is reflected and at times distorted. Its sister newspaper, Izvestia, was Russian for news. And there's an old Russian joke. There is no truth in Pravda, and there is no news in Izvestia. By and large, what I saw of the news media reflect of the day was similar. Not perfect, but they didn't capture the essence of what the day seemed to be about. We saw protesters holding a protest that was illegal, that was against the rules. And we saw protesters resist, a few violently resist, and brought to justice for their crimes. But like what we are so often told in America, a peaceful protest also occurred. Inevitably, what we see in America is these peaceful protests lead to violent riots. But what we didn't see at Olympic Park was arson. What we didn't see at Olympic Park was murder. What we saw was resistance to authorities unlawfully. And that context and that nuance was completely lost in the coverage. Instead, a man with a selfie stick asked real people what they thought, and at times got distracted and talked to people about camera gear and got distracted about flowers. Surely the big news media corps, with their editing rooms and helicopters and professional reporters, could have done a far more comprehensive job of reporting the situation than I, and no one would have wanted to hear what just one man would have to see. But given the fact that 30,000 people watched my stream and almost 50,000 people watched my post, it's clear there is demand for this. It no longer adds up. The 30-second sound bites do not satisfy people's understanding of what is going on. I really think there is a demand for this kind of live, raw, unedited reporting. And they can see the difference between what they see with their own two eyes and the headline they see the next day and say, something is wrong. We rely on news media to take the events of the day and translate it. This translation is becoming lost. Thousands are making the time needed to follow my stream for 4 hours because they can no longer believe the headlines they read the next day. And that brings me to my next point. You have found your trust broken by some people that you thought you could, be it by government, commentators, whatever it might be. But what's happening is that we're receding into our own socially distanced shells. We're saying, hey, all this social distancing is making us isolated. So we're closing down our environment more and more. We're locking ourselves down. And rather than closing ourselves up, I don't think this is going to lead anyone to thrive. I don't think anyone became more successful by distrusting more people, by becoming more skeptical of absolutely everything. What I've seen is that people become successful when they change, when they respond to an event that occurred and find new people to trust, new friends, new sources of information, build some new networks. Stay skeptical, but build something new. Ultimately, the change we're seeing right now are the fruits of people that planted these seeds decades before and took years of building, piece by piece. If we hope to see the same change in our futures for ourselves and for our loved ones and for our country, we're going to have to do the same. We're going to have to plant some seeds in the ground now that blossom into something new. Whether that comes to continuing to cover protests, as I will, and report it live, unedited, or whether it's building a new network of people, of like-minded individuals, whether it's supporting those who are in need, supporting those who will care for you in your time of need as well. Whatever it will be, seeking something that will not return a reward immediately, but instead tomorrow, next week, or next year, is how I believe many of us are going to find success. Overcoming the anxieties, overcoming the fears, overcoming all of those feelings that are screaming at us, trying to tell us something, and trying to interpret those feelings into an action, doing. It might be as simple as picking up the phone with someone that you care about and saying, hey, I'm feeling this. What can we do in an action to try and express this feeling? There's my commentary of it. Hopefully this helped make some sense of what I saw on the weekend, and it will help you interpret what is happening with the changes around the world where you are. You can subscribe to my channel just here. I try and put out what I can. You could reach me on Facebook somewhere up here as well. And you can drop me a message, as that helps feed the cycle of creating content like this and help me understand, did it help you? Do you want to see more of this? Do you want to see less of something? What do you want to cover? I'm actually remarkably up for a chat. That's kind of why I do this. So always love to have a good chat. All right. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe. Apparently that's the end thing. Or give it a thumbs down if you don't. Thanks for watching.